Hey everybody, I'm Wes.
And I'm Savannah.
Welcome to the Tiny Watts installation videos. Today we're going to show you how to hook into your alternator.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we're going to be installing our standard alternator tie-in. If you have the 24 volt upgrade, be sure to check out our 24 volt alternator upgrade video. But today we're just installing our standard alternator install. So we have our number 4 power cable that came in your Tiny Watts Phase 1 kit. And then we have the input whip that also came in your Tiny Watts Phase 1 kit. We also have our 80 amp surface mount breaker. A couple of other basic things. We got a pilot drill. We also have our drill bit for our 1/4-20 rib nuts, and of course our favorite rib nut gun. Other than that, just some thread locker and a couple zip ties. So those are all the tools you're going to need. Let's go ahead and get started underneath the van. First step to tying into the alternator circuit is we're going to want to remove the negative post off the factory battery. That way we are completely disconnected from the Mercedes computer system. Today we're working on a Sprinter van, but if for your application you're doing a Ford Transit or a ProMaster, you can just remove the negative post off the factory starter battery. So now that we removed the negative post, I'm going to go underneath the van and we're going to install our 80 amp surface mount circuit breaker. I'm going to take a Sharpie and we're going to start off with our spring-loaded center punch. This is another one of those van life favorite tools. If you don't have one of these, you're going to want one. You're going to be drilling lots of holes in your van. So we got a link to that below. Now it's time to go under the van. Okay, so we are underneath the driver's seat in a Sprinter 144. Couple points of reference here. We have a boot coming out below the driver's seat, and then this over here is our starter battery positive, where we are going to be tapping into the system. Hooking into your alternator circuit is a lot easier than it sounds. All you got to do is connect the input wire to the positive post on your starter battery. So I'll walk you through that in a second, but first we're going to start with mounting our 80 amp surface breaker. This is a waterproof breaker. You actually can see that right here. It says waterproof. So it's okay to mount this outside. And I'm going to install it right here. So a little trick of the trade here is on the back side of this circuit breaker, I put some double-sided tape. And what that's going to do for me is just kind of hold it in place while I get all the marks I want. It's not necessary, but it's nice to have. So I'm going to go ahead and stick that on here. And now I'm going to take 2 marking devices. Start with the Sharpie. Mark both holes. And then I'll back that up with our spring-loaded center punch. Just trying to stay right in the middle of both of those holes. There's one. Now that we got our marks, we can pop this circuit breaker off of here, and then we'll drill our pilot hole. There's our marks. So we're going to go ahead and drill our pilot hole. So I just got a pilot bit here. This is just an 1/8 inch drill bit, and I got both my marks. I rolled out of the way, so I'm not going to get a shower of metal shavings here, but I'm just going to go ahead and drill these pilot holes first. There's our first one. Then we're going to come over here and get that second pilot hole. Perfect. So we got both pilot holes drilled. Next up, we're going to drill our 23/64 hole. That is the perfect size drill bit for a 1/4-20 rib nut. So we're going to line that up on our pilot hole. So we got our first one drilled, and then we'll go over here and start on our second one. Sweet, so we got our second hole drilled. This is just some body butter here from the factory. Can clean that mess out of the way. Okay, so I'm just going to take some paper towels, kind of wipe that gooey body butter stuff out of the way. Okay, so I got my rib nut gun with a 1/4-20 mandrel, and of course we have air compressor here in the shop, so I'm just going to hook this up to air. And then these are our 2 1/4-20 threaded inserts that we're going to go install. Okay, so we got our 1/4-20 rib nut gun. We're just going to take that threaded insert, slide it on, or thread it onto the end of the mandrel. We love this tool because we can just take it, slide it up into that hole, holding it flat against the rail, pull the trigger, and it squeezes that insert. We can hit it again. So now we back that off. And we're left with stainless steel threaded insert to mount our circuit breaker to. Go ahead and repeat the same process here for the other hole. Unthread it here off the back of the rib nut gun. And right there, we have our 2 threaded inserts to install our circuit breaker. All right, next step, we are going to install our 80 amp circuit breaker. We're gonna kind of try and reuse our sticky tape there for a second, hold us in place while we grab our bolts. Okay, so we're just gonna prepare our bolt, take some thread locker, put a little bit on the threads, and then we'll take our circuit breaker, 80 amp circuit breaker here, put that bolt through, and just get it started by hand. We can take our T-handle, get a couple more threads on that, and then we'll repeat the same step with our second bolt. We already got some thread locker on there. Grab our T-handle and thread that into place. Tighten both of those down all the way. So what you end up with, super secure connection that's fully serviceable. If for some reason we ever had a problem with this circuit breaker, we could just undo these bolts and remove it and replace it as needed. Next step, we are going to hook up the input to this circuit breaker to the starter battery positive up here. I think I have the little one. Yep, sweet. Let me just make sure that's long enough. Yep. Look at that. Cool. And then is there a socket wrench up there? Sweet. Okay, so next step, we have our alternator whip here that came in our Tiny Watts Phase 1 kit. You'll see it's got a label on there. It says alternator breaker positive, and it's a 1/4 inch lug. On the other side, it says starter battery positive. So that is a 5/16 lug. That is pretty straightforward, but we're going to take starter battery positive and go hook it up to the starter battery, and then leave this one here. So when we're going to hook up the starter battery positive side, first thing we want to do is land on the circuit breaker first. That way when we do land on the starter battery, this wire becomes energized. It'll already be safely terminated here at the circuit breaker. So we're going to take a 10mm socket, pop this bolt off of here, take our alternator jumper, land that 1/4 inch lug, get the first couple threads started by hand. Now that we got that landed, we can go ahead and tighten it all the way. So we got that nice and tight, no loose connections. we can take our little rubber insulator, put that on the end of the stud. So one thing I'll point out, this circuit breaker is currently open. That's what we want. And how you can tell is this reset yellow bar is sticking out the side about 30 degrees. When that reset bar is all the way closed like that, this circuit breaker would be closed. So you press this red button here to open that up. That way we know this wire is safely terminated, nothing will be energized, and we can hook this in to the starter battery positive. First step there is going to be to kind of route this up towards where the starter battery is. And we're going to come in here from the side and attach behind this plastic. Grab this cap. That just kind of wiggles back and forth. And we can pop that cap out of there. So we just pop off that plastic cap, fish that down. And that exposes the starter battery positive. That is an energized stud. So we would not want to take a wrench and touch from this positive post to the frame of the van, because there is a chance to create a short circuit and therefore a spark. So we want to be really careful when we're taking our socket wrench to this post. But once we land that lug, we're already safely terminated at the breaker and we're good to go. Okay, so I'm going to take my 13mm socket and loosen this starter battery post. You want to be careful during this step not to touch your wrench from this post to the frame of the van. And I do that by just kind of using my hand as an insulator around the exposed metal edge of the wrench. So I can go ahead and get my socket landed on there and kind of supporting this stud with one hand. I'm going to take the wrench and just loosen. Now I'm going to get the wrench out of the way, loosen that by hand. Okay, so we're going to take our starter battery positive, and I'm actually going to flip it over so it's flat side down, and I'm going to pull this post off from the factory, slip this in so it sits flat against that factory tab, and then I'll go ahead and reinstall the factory positive lead. So you can see there, now our input wire is coming off the same direction that the factory lead was, and I'll show you why that's important in just a second. So I'm just threading that nut back on there by hand. We're going to grab our 13mm socket again. Again, always being careful not to touch the frame with this as we tighten. We're just going to kind of hold that all in place. Nice and snug. No loose connections there. And then we can actually take this factory plastic piece and it'll slip right on exactly the way it was. So kind of just feed that top piece up and snap that on just like that. So we're back to having an insulated connection here. Follow that wire down. We're landed here at the circuit breaker. Next step is going to be to take our alternator power cable, which is this 25-foot whip here, and we're going to run it back to the Tiny Watts kit. Again, one thing to point out, it's labeled, which is nice. We have alternator input kit. Point here is that is a 5/16 lug going to the Tiny Watts kit. But on the input side, alternator in breaker, we have a 1/4 inch lug. So it is directional. It does matter which one lands where, and that's why I wanted to point that out before we start running that power cable all the way back to the Tiny Watts Power Center. Okay, so I got that alternator power cable fished through here above the fuel neck, and I'm just going to land the input side on this 10mm nut here. Pop that off. Go ahead and land that 1/4 inch side, labeled alternator input breaker, and just land that right there. Throw our lock washer on, and then take our nut and get that threaded on there next. Back to our 10mm socket. Nice and tight. No loose connections. Take that insulating cap, put it back on the stud, and we're going to leave this circuit breaker open. We're going to run this wire all the way back to the Tiny Watts power center using zip ties up against the factory frame and the factory harness until we get back to the Tiny Watts kit. We'll show you how to do that next. Okay, so we have our alternator power cable here. There's our fuel neck coming out, and I zip tied up here to the frame members. We're going all the way down the side of the van. Double zip ties on each of those. Then we take a turn here right at the end of the fuel tank. Jump onto this factory harness. Right after the fuel tank is a really good spot to cross over the van. And so we cross over right there, staying high and tight, above the exhaust, high and tight. And then we swoop around this frame member before we go through this factory puck that we haven't landed yet, and that goes up to the Tiny Watts kit. So I'm just going to cut my zip ties now that we got that cable routed all the way. It's okay, like, the loom thing's definitely an extra step. We used to not loom. I kind of thought about the YouTube haters more when we did it the first time than this time. Okay, so we're over here on the passenger side of the van. You can see this factory puck is where I went through. So I'm going to actually just terminate that. Just pop that back into place. Perfect. So we got our alternator wire going up and in, up to the Tiny Watts power center. And then right here we got our chassis ground. And you can see I've drilled a little hole in this frame member. And now I'm going to take a flathead screwdriver and just scrape off this underbody coat. What we're looking to do here is expose the bare metal, and that way we'll have a nice solid electrical connection to the chassis of the vehicle. Okay, so I've cleared the underbody coating, but you can still see this kind of waxy finish on there. So I'm going to take my flathead and I'm going to keep scraping until I see shiny metal in this whole area. Perfect. It's got nice, shiny, exposed metal surface. Okay, so we got our 3/4 20 bolt. I'm going to feed that through this 1/4 inch washer and then through our lug. Then go ahead, thread that through the chassis of the van. There we go. Okay, so last step here, we're going to take our nylock, throw that on the other side of the bolt, and then we'll tighten this into place. So I have a 7/16 socket wrench now, and my T-handle. Now I can tighten that chassis ground. So right here we got our chassis ground landed to the frame. Nice secure connection. Last step will be to come back with some paint And we'll actually just spray some Rust-Oleum on this whole area, and that way we'll prevent any rust from happening due to the exposed metal. Just going to take some Rust-Oleum, spray over that whole area. That should do it.
And that's it.
Be sure to check out our other installation videos.
And we'll see you soon.
Cheers.